Hey guys, and welcome to season 2 or episode or time period 2 of AP Euro with Miss Clark. We created a sign and I'm kind of struggling with if it's going to show up backwards or not. I don't know. Mirror images. But we're starting time period 2, episode 6. And we are talking all about absolutism and starting to get into absolutism and basically like the English Civil War. So that's what this video is going to be about. So let's jump right in. It's going to be from 1648 to 1815. And we're going to start off with how does absolutism grow in France? First things first. So it starts off with Francis I. He is going to be that first king who is going to be nationalizing the church in France. He is also going to be having that whole Concordat of Bologna, which basically says that the Pope can take money, but it basically gives more power to the ruler. It's kind of like, hey, like I'll pay you, I'll let you take money in exchange. I can have more power over the Pope. So the next 3 guys that are going to come up are going to be Henry II, Francis II, and then Charles IX. And so all 3 of them are basically gonna be sponsoring these civil wars. They're really gonna be having a lot of civil wars with the Huguenots. It's sort of like a Huguenot civil war because of the whole clash between Protestantism and Catholicism. And that's gonna go right into the War of the 3 Henrys, which we know that Henry of Navarre ends up winning and he becomes Henry IV. And so as we kind of go into European history, as you remember, pretty much everybody has the same name. And, you know, just because we have a Henry in France does not necessarily mean that it's the same thing as the Henry that's going on concurrently in England. And so while we're kind of going away from like Henry of Navarre and you know, moving on in France to the Louis.
So it's about now in my editing capabilities when I realized that I missed talking about the Louis. I had somebody come into my classroom and I completely missed that I didn't talk about them. So I'm gonna just have a really quick Louis moment to talk about how the Louis get onto the scene, because they are very important when we're talking about absolutist monarchs in France. So it kind of goes to the next person, who's gonna be Louis the 13th, and Louis the 13th is gonna be the ruler during the 30 Years' War, and he is going to be the person who is behind the throne, and honestly Cardinal Richelieu is going to be running the whole show during the 30 Years' War. And then we go into Louis the 14th, who's going to be the Sun King. And he, as the Sun King, is known as that because he's basically the sun of Europe. As in, everything kind of revolves around him. He's going to be the monarch who's going to create Versailles and this extremely, extremely extravagant, this is the height of France's power with Louis the 14th. He's going to have that really famous saying, "I am the state." And he's going to be waging tons of wars, including the war for the throne of Spanish succession. And he is going to have a huge major play when it comes later on to Louis XVI and the French Revolution. So it's super duper important that you remember Louis the 14th as the Sun King. So I went through and I drew little stars next to the ones that I think that are really important for you to remember. As long as you kind of remember who won the War of the 3 Henrys, and then as long as you remember the first 2 Louis for this video, that's pretty good for the throne of absolutism in France.
We start off the bat with the Tudors in England, and the Tudors in England are really going to start off with Henry VII. He's going to be, he is running a really tight ship, very cheap and very stern, and that is the complete opposite of his son, his second son, who ends up taking over, and that's going to be Henry VIII. And Henry VIII is going to be that guy, if you remember, who creates the Anglican Church because he wants to have this different wife, and he wants to be able to marry Anne Boleyn instead of Catherine. And so he's going to be our next Henry. And he's insane, so if you remember all of his different wives. And then his one remaining heir is going to be Edward VI. And Edward VI really only reigns for 6 years. He doesn't really do a lot because he's underage and also because he's sick for the majority of it. And then we get to his sister, who is Mary I. And Mary I is also known as Bloody Mary. And Bloody Mary is going to be called Bloody Mary because her name is drenched with the blood of all of the Protestants that she kills during her reign. And so when she ends up, well, first off, she ends up marrying Philip II of Spain. Important to note, it's not a real marriage, it's just a political marriage, which means that like they don't actually live together in the same country. And then when Mary I dies of breast cancer, her sister, who is Elizabeth I, ends up taking over, and she is one of the best rulers in England. She's very, very well known. She rules for a very long time. She's called the Virgin Queen. She's extremely intelligent. A lot of people during her reign thought that she did not have the right to the throne because technically she was a bastard child. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, who ended up being beheaded because Anne Boleyn, not Elizabeth I. Anne Boleyn ended up being beheaded by the king because he thought that she was a witch, and he also wanted to get married again. And during her reign, she is very good because she doesn't start this whole war between the Protestants and the Catholics. She creates these things called the 39 Articles. And in the 39 Articles, she's pretty neutral. She kind of like, you can do what you want. Going back to the idea of maybe she's not technically allowed to rule. So Philip II, if you remember, married Mary I. And he thought that the throne legally belonged to him, technically, since Elizabeth was a bastard child. And so he got his Spanish Armada, which is one of the strongest sailing forces in the entire world, and tries to sail over to England to take it back. And luckily, on Elizabeth's behalf, there's a hurricane that manages to basically wipe out the entire Spanish Armada, and Elizabeth ends up becoming this like hero and this legend. So Elizabeth is the Virgin Queen, and she never has any kids. And so when she decides to give up her throne, she is going to be giving it to basically one of her cousin's sons. The cousin's name was Mary, Queen of Scots, because she's the Queen of Scotland. She also, Mary, Queen of Scots, wanted the throne of England, and Elizabeth found out about it and killed her. And so she's like, well, maybe I'll make it up to her and give the throne of England to her son, James I. And James I came in, and he had a really hard time because he wanted to dissolve Parliament. Parliament ended up coming back, and there's going to be that constant kind of a struggle between Parliament and himself. And he luckily was pretty adept at handling Parliament, but his son, Charles I, is not going to be very good at handling Parliament. He wanted to come in and take over as an authoritarian rule. They're in the Stuart household now. However, Parliament really didn't want to deal with him, didn't want to pay for all of the wars that he wanted to be involved in, and so they tried to make all of these different rules for him to follow, and he did not want to follow any of these rules, thinking that I am the absolute ruler, Parliament should really be listening to me. And that started the English Civil War. The English Civil War goes from 1642 to 1649, and it is basically a war between Parliament and the monarchy. And Parliament is going to be supported by the Roundheads, is their nickname, and then the Royalists or the Cavaliers are going to be supporting the king. So the way that I had my students remember it is going to be Roundheads fought for Parliament and screwed over the Cavaliers king. So I know LeBron James is no longer with the Cavaliers, but you know, those are kind of weird names. So that's kind of the best I could do with that one. So the parliamentarians end up winning, and they behead poor Charles I. And then Oliver Cromwell becomes basically the Lord Protector, ruling with Parliament. When he dies, his son, Richard Cromwell, tries to take over, not very successful. It doesn't actually end up being Lord Protector, and they decide to give it back to the monarchy. Going back, and it goes to Charles II, Charles I's son. And a lot of people from the Whig Party, which is going to be a political party in England during this time period, are very suspicious of him and the fact that he's actually pretty pro-Catholic. And so to be able to get funding from Parliament, Parliament demands that he does not marry his son, James II, to a Catholic. well, Charles II doesn't like to be told what to do because he's an absolute ruler. So he specifically sets up his son with a Catholic woman. And that is when Parliament's like, no, we are drawing the line. That's it, we're done. Like, we're done with this line, like, let's cut it off. And so they go, instead of keeping James II, who's very pro-Catholic, they go to William and Mary of Orange. And William and Mary of Orange are technically from Denmark, and we're going to talk about them more in a second, but they're very Protestant. And so they bring, they're very Dutch. And so they bring them over, and they manage to come back in this time period called the Glorious Revolution. And when they come back, they set up this sweet spot called, like, that glorious time period afterwards with the English Constitution, giving a lot more freedoms, a lot more rights. And so England's going to be one of those countries that sets a precedent for the rest of Europe as far as rights for the common man. And that's kind of going into John's Locke whole theory when we get into the Enlightenment of having the consent of the governed. Well, William and Mary definitely have the consent of the governed. One last time period that we have to talk about is going to be the Dutch independence. So Philip II of Spain, remember the old, I'm gonna marry Bloody Mary and then England's mine, but no, I'm losing all my ships. He also really wanted to control Denmark and the Netherlands. And so he was trying, well, basically he controlled the Netherlands and he tried to change the religion. That's a no-no. Then he also tried to control the economy. The economy of the Netherlands and the Dutch is extremely wealthy because we have the Dutch East India Trading Company. Not good. And so he ends up sending a whole bunch of people like the Duke of Alva, and he tries to send them in to fix the problem. However, their methods are extremely violent and they kill thousands and thousands of people in single days. And the people decide to rise up against the king, the Spanish king, Philip II. And this is going to be that same William of Orange that we are thinking about with the Glorious Revolution. And they end up splitting this region into kind of two different sections. So the southern part is still going to be belonging to Spain. It's going to be the Spanish Netherlands, which later becomes Belgium. And then the upper part kind of turns into just the Dutch Netherlands, and they are going to be very Catholic. And this is when we enter into that Dutch Golden Age time period. This is when you're going to have so much money because not only do we have the Dutch East India Trading Company, you're also going to have the enclosure movement, when you're enclosing all these things in and turning agriculture from subsistence farming into commercial farming with that commercial revolution. So very rich, very great time period. You're going to see those great painters, the Rembrandts, the Vermeers, the Van Eyck, the Durer, and then a new one, Peter Paul Rubens, is gonna bust on the scene towards the end of this time period. And so those are gonna start us off with the absolutist time period with the French. How did the French get there to lead to the French Revolution? We already had our English Civil War earlier, and then how did we get to the Dutch Golden Age?